to make the military go back to barracks when it's held the reins of power for so long. In Sudan, Saturday's use of live ammunition to quell protest against last month's coup shows the determination of a junta which never went away after the ouster of longtime strongman Omar al-Bashir. At best, it agreed to power sharing with civilians during the transition. Now, if, say, you're the regime's number two and head the notorious Rapid Support Forces, which is accused of war crimes in Darfur, what's the incentive to relinquish power and face the prospect of a one-way trip to The Hague and the International Criminal Court? What response from the international community to Saturday and its aftermath, most notably the arrest of the bureau chief of Qatari TV channel Al Jazeera? And if it's not possible to convince the junta to go quietly, what is the next move? For viewers in the Arab world, this probably feels like they've seen this movie before, in Egypt and more recently in Algeria, where the ones with the guns wore down a street clamoring for reform. Today in the France 24 debate, what next for Sudan's unfinished revolution? Joining us from Khartoum, Kholoud Khair, managing partner of the think tank Insight Strategy Partners. Thanks for speaking with us here on.
Thank you.
Also joining us here in the studio, activist Jafar Mohamed Sainin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And Abdelhamid Mahmoud. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And from the French Loire Valley town of Saumur, former French ambassador to Sudan, Michel Rimbaud, whose books include, I guess I can loosely translate it as Sudan in all of its states. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Our hashtag is F24debate. Yes, Saturday's death toll has now risen to 8, say local medics. This as Sudan's junta denies using live rounds. Yeah, audio footage posted to social media suggesting otherwise. Still, authorities insist they only used minimum force. Brian Quinn has more.
In this amateur video, a wounded man is rushed to safety by demonstrators. Here, anti-coup protesters display the shell casings from live ammunition they say Sudanese security forces fired at them. With the country's internet shut down for the past 3 weeks, protest leaders now organize via SMS or even graffiti on walls. On Saturday, that was enough to bring tens of thousands of Sudanese out into the streets of Greater Khartoum to say no to military rule.
Our demand is to bring down the military council and to bring back the civilian government. We are tired of the military rule, and we hope that not a single soldier will rule us.
On Thursday, the coup's leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, tightened his grip on power, forming a new governing council that excludes the civilian leaders with whom the military had been sharing power since the 2019 ouster of dictator Omar al-Bashir. Many of those civilian leaders, along with Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, were detained on October 25th when the military seized power. The US and several European states have denounced the coup and called for Hamdok's return. At least 18 people have been killed and more than 300 wounded amid the military's efforts to quash the protest movement.
Kholoud Khair, your thoughts on what happened Saturday and what civilians do next?
Well, the civilians, I think, are settling in for the long haul. It's quite clear that the coup regime is trying to buy time in order to put in place the government that it promised to. But that's proving quite difficult because most political parties, with the exception of remnants of Bashir's Islamist regime, have refused to join the new coup government. And so the street rightly has realized that this is very much a continuation of the revolution that brought down Bashir and as they thought, brought down his entire system. Which of course it hasn't, and the coup regime has been very quickly bringing back those people into the halls of government. And so I think the street has been reading this very, very well and have realized that it's going to take perhaps similar mobilization tactics and sort of the longevity that we saw in 2018, 2019 to unseat this regime too.
And how do you do it? For instance, if they came to organizing a general strike, how do you do it when the internet's shut?
Well, I mean, the one thing that was a lesson well learned from the 2019 experience is how to mobilize without the access to the internet. And so it has gone, almost entirely analog. Some people are able to have access to the internet intermittently, but on the whole, it's been, flyers, posters, messages on walls sprayed across the city, SMS text messages, which still work, although at the beginning, since the coup was announced, it wasn't. And so I think, the resistance committees have forged over the past 3 years very close bonds, not just across the neighborhoods where they started, but really across the states and across to other states across Sudan. And so those systems that have been cultivated over the past 3 years have really been operationalized now. And so it's from what I'm sensing, it's a very well-oiled machine and can withstand the lack of internet. Of course, though, not having internet is a sign that things are amiss, that regardless of what the coup regime says, things are not normal. And of course, bringing them back is an essential right. And so people will continue to fight for that despite the great mobilization. And
Kholoud, just before I turn to the rest of our panel here, how is it working? Because the coup happened on October 25th. Are civil servants showing up for work? Is daily life going on as normal?
I think initially, when the coup was announced, within probably an hour, people were outside of their homes. There was no plan yet for resistance, but the reaction was resolute and it was immediate, complete rejection of the coup. And since that time, we have seen much more planning in terms of the main protest days and much more sort of organized civil disobedience and strikes. And of course, recognizing that this is a very sort of well-honed technique that civilians are using, we're hearing that particularly outside of Khartoum, members of the security forces are going door to door, knocking for people to make sure that they go into work, to sort of try and break this solidarity. But people, regardless of whether they're going into work or not, regardless of whether the streets are back sort of functioning or not, it's not a sign that the resistance is dwindling, but a sign that people are trying to manage both, eking out a living given the poor economic conditions, but also maintaining their resistance.
Jafar Mohammed Sainin, was this coup avoidable?
Could have been avoidable.
How?
How had our elites been honest with the people? But what happened was in contrary, because what was signed between the FFC and this junta in August 2019 in Addis Ababa was unacceptable. It fell below the aspiration of the mass. And when they went on to sign this, the so-called declaration of transition period, the mass found themselves out of this declaration.
But those who take a pragmatic approach might say, well, it's not ideal, but at least it helped avoid bloodshed.
No, the military, the junta, could have not gone further extreme than what they have done in sit-and camp when they went on to massacre more than 200 people in broad daylight. Some of them were thrown into the Nile. So they could have not gone further extreme than that. And at the time, the momentum was there. People were saying, look, we could go on until we'll make them to surrender to our commitment. But what happened was this hijacking of scene by the political incubator. And then things went wrong from that point. And this, as a result of that, what we call...
And okay, so that's what happened before.
Yeah.
But is part of the problem as well that there were cracks within the civilians during the transition period, most notably of late, people growing impatient, wondering, well, can't the transition happen faster? Why aren't we seeing economic benefits right away?
Well, the problem, because, like I said, the fatal mistake was made from the beginning. And this is when everything is gone totally wrong. And the junta have taken this advantage to just try to, get more grip on power by dividing the political incubator in two groups, by paving the way to this coup d'etat, which was foreseen. We have seen, we have anticipated this was coming. The way it was propagated was going to the coup d'etat. The junta will never, because the only chance the Sudanese had to get rid of the hegemony of the junta was in between April 2019 and June, when the massacre took place.
So, Abdelhamid Mahmoud, the divide and conquer strategy of the junta, as described, ahead of the end of that 3-year transition period, can we now say that it's succeeded?
Unfortunately, it hasn't been succeeded because as Jafar said, it was not well founded, and the constitution document has many faults, fundamental errors or faults. One of the fundamental errors is that there is no condition that military power should go out of the regime or out of controlling the country, or at least as in France we see that Macron is the leader of the armed forces. So if Hamdok is not the leader of armed forces,
The Prime
coup
Minister.
d'etat is here. It's a problem is here. Coup d'etat, at any time we can expect that coup d'etat can take place. But the problem
So you heard Jafar say they should have waited longer and the balance of power would have been even more in their favor. But is that really possible when the military's been around for so long to sort of exclude them?
It's possible.
At that time, Sudanese people are very enthusiastic to go ahead in order to rule them out forever. At that time.
So what about today?
At the time of the sitting there.
Back in 2019. But what about today? Now, after we've seen what's happened on Saturday, at this point in time, is the momentum in the junta's favor?
To my own point of view, I'm not really optimistic because there is no way now. And I don't think that these movements, these demonstrations will take them out, will oblige them, will force them to at least pass the power to civilians. This is not possible because particularly when we see like the movement, armed movement, rebel, I mean the rebellions like Dr. Jibril and Minni Arkuminawi, they have been fighting against this regime for 20 years, and now they are putting their hands in solidarity with this junta and saying that because...
Why? Why are these former rebels now together with the junta? Why did they make this pact?
This is very paradoxical. This is very paradoxical because when we see this now, we saw the video, they shot the peaceful protesters in the streets, and for 20 years they have been saying that we are bringing you the liberty and individual liberty and peace.
I answered that.
Now they see that people are being shot by live ammunition and they keep silent. I don't know.
I answered to this question why the rebel leaders like Minni Manawi and Jibril sided with the junta. Because when they signed that Juba peace agreement to come to Khartoum to witness the new Sudan, this freedom, liberty-thirsty young generation who liberated themselves from the mainstream political party, they got out of the straitjacket. People, aspiration was to Sudan, real Sudan through democratic transition. And they realized like a junta in democracy, they will not survive. Because in democracy, the people will have a lot of question mark on these guys. This is why they sided with the junta.
Michel Rimbaud, it's a case of those with guns who speak the same language faced with those calling for civilian rule? Michel Rimbaud, can you hear us?
Oh yes, excuse me. I was listening, but yes, I think that the situation is very confused. I have the impression that we are witnessing the same demonstration. We have been witnessing the same demonstration, endless demonstration for the same goal since the fall of Omar al-Bashir. For the time being, I think it's complicated, but it's very simple at the same time, because we are just in wait for the prospect of the election that was supposed to take place next year in 2022. I am not sure that the election will take place. This is the problem, finally, because the demonstration, as it was said before, we don't know how it will work. The military are taken the power, through belonging to the National Transitional Council, Sovereignty Council, and they were a part. They had the power for one part of the time. They were supposed to transfer the power to the civilian leadership, and they are very reluctant to do so. It is quite obvious.
And let me ask you on that, Ambassador Rimbaud. When you saw at the outset that makeup, it was half civilians, half military in that transitional council back in 2019, and you saw that the man known as Hemdeti, who runs that paramilitary force that's accused of war crimes in Darfur, was the number two. Wasn't the writing on the wall? Because it's never going to be in his interest to hand over power to civilians, is it? Because then he'd wind up at the ICC.
But of course, if we take the personalities that are taking part in the government, it is clear that they are not new men. They are all stemming from the previous regime, the regime of Omar al-Bashir, including Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Hamdok and Hamiti. Because let's not forget that the real number two in terms of power is Hamiti, that was very famous for being responsible or being accused of exactions and murders in the Darfur, during the Darfur war, as a leader of the Janjaweed. It is forgotten, but it existed a long time. And to see him as the number two of the power system is very strange. But anyway, for the time being, I suppose that I have never seen, for my part, military taking the power and leaving it very graciously. I suppose that the military that took the power through peace process, let's say, and tried to keep it and to take it 100% through a military coup, an attempt in September, a coup in October, and some very strong measures against the civilian leadership in November. I think that this government is not good for the future of democracy in the Sudan. And I am quite, I doubt that there will be elections in those circumstances, that there will be elections next year. And this is all the problem for the future of democracy, because the demonstration, as it was said, can continue and go on and on, again and again for months, even for years. But if the military are at power, and if the military are toppled, and the new military government comes to take the leadership, I think that there will be no progress about democracy. And at the same time,
no progress on democracy. Let me bring in Khaloud Khair on that. Do you agree? And did you, again, back in 2019, when you saw that there were people like Hemdeti who were front and center in that transitional government? Did you at the time know that this perhaps was a foreshadowing that this would never come to term, the transitional period towards elections, Holod Hayir?
I think, to the point about elections, I think democratic change is more than just elections. I think democratic change is what we see in the street, what we saw in the street last Saturday. And that elections are, certainly in Sudan's history, but also in other countries, are always sort of an exercise for the elite, and oftentimes an exercise for the existing regime to legitimize themselves. So I don't think there's many people are holding out hope that under this coup regime that any elections, whether they are snap elections like we saw in Egypt, or whether they take place further down the line, if they do take place, would be free and fair, right? So I think democracy is in the detail, democracy is in the everyday practices. Going back to the 2019 power sharing agreement, I agree with the other speakers that the writing was pretty much on the wall, I think, given the way that power sharing agreement was negotiated. It was mostly an elite exercise that left out many of the revolutionaries from the streets, from the resistance committees, from youth groups, etc. But it was also too much of a compromise given how well the street was able to demonstrate its strength at the time, particularly after the 3rd of June massacre. And so the question then becomes, how do we not recreate those same mistakes this time around? Because the resistance committees have been very clear to say that they are not willing to negotiate with the military. They don't see it as legitimate now, especially that it has undertaken this coup. And so the mediation tactics that are being used, the methodological orthodoxies of mediation need to now be reshaped so that they are able to respond to an amorphous movement like the resistance committees, that don't have specific set leaders and leadership structures. And I think actually...
And let me ask you just a question on that, Holud Hayir, because Sudan is an extremely cosmopolitan country. You have many different languages, ethnic groups, and is it possible, what you're describing, for those civilian groups to retain a united front?
I think what the resistance committees have done very well is that they have limited, or they have, made their demands around what are basically universal demands by everyone in Sudan, which is that they want to live a life free of oppression, that they want justice and accountability, and that they want peace, because of course the whole country has these little facets of conflict that are not able to be resolved through any kind of peace agreement modality that currently exists. And so these are things that everybody asks for, regardless of background. And we saw that very clearly in the demonstrations. You had all different walks of people, different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different levels of religious devotion. And that just shows you how universal that message is. Now, the question is, how do we translate that universal message into a political stance that is able to be incorporated into a political dispensation? And I think that is the work of all civilian groups, as well as the military, which will have to meet the civilians partway, as well as the mediators. The fact that the military is more legible in many ways to mediators shouldn't mean that, yet again, like in 2019, it is the civilians who are asked to compromise, because mediators can't understand the ways in which they function, because they do have the broadest representation.
And who those mediators, just to tell our viewers, who are they?
Well, there are several strands of mediation that are currently taking place. There is the United Nations missions, which exists in Sudan at the moment. There are also bilateral, as well as multilateral tracks like the AU, the Troika. South Sudan also had a very sort of short-lived mediation effort. It has basically been dwindled down to two now, and we're left with the UNITAM's mission and a domestic mediation track with the wise men. But what that means now is that the more concerted effort needs to take place with what is left of the mediation to work with resistance committees to help them reach their demands. And what's different to 2019 is that you don't have the political parties that one of your speakers spoke about, sort of in the middle, getting in the way of the voice of the street. What you have now is a direct path from the street to the mediators, unfiltered by political parties, which I think is what led to the compromise in the first place.
So, Jafar Mohammed Saini, you're hearing there, Khalid Khair seeing the glass half full. On the one hand, you have the junta, which has staged this coup. On the other hand, the civilian bodies have perhaps learned lessons from 2019. You agree with what she's saying?
Well, I almost agree with what she said, but let's come back to the last point that she made concerning the mediation. The Sudan problem is very much complex, cannot be resolved by mere mediation. Because there is this mentality with the elites, that with the elite and this military junta, that let's bygone what is gone. This doesn't work with this. The new generation who rose, who got out of this straitjacket of this the old political thinking, and they see the world before them. They want the result immediately. They want transition as it's meant. They want this transition. In order to move toward transition, it has to start with accountability. We're talking about Sudan, the 30 years of accumulated injustice.
Right, but what you're saying is exactly what when we have done shows about Algeria, people are saying there. The youth want accountability, they want reform, but of course we've seen how the movement in Algeria has petered out. It's run out of steam. Once a junta is there, it stays. You heard Ambassador Rambo.
It will be, highly inconvenient to compare the situation of Algeria and Sudan. Sudan has been going through internal conflicts for almost 60 years. The last 30 years, there have been so much injustice being committed. And that injustice, that's one, is what's impeding the progress. What impeding the progress is the injustice that the elites, the junta, they don't want to talk about, Francois. I'm talking to you today. I've been waiting in justice for 30 years. 30 years when this junta killed my father. Now, to this day, we're talking about Sudanese revolution, which was glorified by the international community, which was given a good example. To this day, no one came to say, Jafar, sorry to you. No one came to say, Jafar, I will take responsibility. And do you think how many of Jafar like that in Sudan? There are hundreds of thousands of Jafar victims are waiting for the justice to be done. Until the elites and this junta come to realize what is impeding the progress is injustice. Until they realize that unless we address this issue of injustice, we will not. There's no way out of this, the internal conflicts. So now, the state, who represents the state? State is represented by neighborhood communities, represented by the independent activists, represented by the mass who refused to settle down, with the junta on August 2019.
But are they more united or more divided than they were in 2019?
More united.
More divided.
You're saying they're more divided.
I totally agree with you, Abdul Hamid.
This is why they are being ruled by military power. This is the only reason. If they are really united, if they just settle down and arise
Abdul Hamid, let me finish my point. Why I can say they are straight today, they are more united, more determined, more... why I can say that? Because people on 30, when they came out, they didn't came out because what the political party, no, they came out just automatically. Here,
as leaders are divided, this is an indicator that social forces are divided inside. Go ahead.
Those all 10 of thousands of Sudanese who came out in diaspora, in places like Paris, London, Washington, to give more momentum to the state of Sudan, have they been pushed?
It is not enough to change power relation.
No.
Let
me finish this point. What I'm saying is the state is more united, more wise, more, how do you say, determined than ever because nobody is telling them to come out. They are coming out automatically.
They're coming out spontaneously.
Spontaneously, that's right.
Abdelhamid Mahmoud, why are they more divided, you think?
They are internal conditions are not met, like the unification. They are really divided because if their leaders are divided, this is a good indicator that the social forces are inside divided, because their leaders, those leaders who have been fighting for 20 years, and their armed forces are now joining those military junta in order to rule, and they deny that these people, these protesters, at least deserve liberty and being treated peacefully. Those peaceful demonstrators are being shot and killed.
Mainstream,
and this is one thing. Let me tell you one thing. Let me tell you one thing. One thing is very important. At that peace agreement, people refused, many of social forces, like 50% of social forces refused to at least put the secularism as in the constitution in order to rule away the ideology, Islamic ideology, Arabic ideology. This in Sudan, our main problem is ethnic conflict. It is between African and Arab conflict, and everybody wants to put his ideology in the state in order to rule the others. And people refused secularism in Sudan because they believe in their own customs, their own religions. So in this case, they don't deserve other than, I don't support military junta, but at this time, these objective conditions are not being met. Our sister said that they are universal claims. There is no universal claims. We have to study at least the context and our historical culture and these communities. It's more complex.
So let me bring in because we're running short on time. Let me bring in Khaloud Khair on this. Khaloud, you're hearing there Abdelrahim saying the problem is mindsets have not evolved enough on both sides, the military and the civilian side.
I think to some extent that's right, because the military has not sort of let go of or started to think about ways in which it could be involved in Sudanese, the Sudanese landscape without having maximum control of the political sphere and maximum control of the economy. And so I think that has been the struggle of the past 2 years, how to begin to have the conversation around security sector reform. Unfortunately, there hasn't been enough time for that, and of course that's by design. I'd just like to respond to the comment, though, that that there is this problem of African and Arab. I think that's not going to get us anywhere. I think that mindset needs to shift. It's much more multi-layered than that, and this sort of really distills it down into very basic categories that I think aren't really helpful.
Don't you deny? Do you deny that there is conflict identity crisis in Sudan?
Abdelhamid, we are not.
One at a time. Khaloud Khair.
I think that there is an identity crisis in Sudan, and I think the conversations around that, particularly within young people, are starting to happen meaningfully. I don't think us asserting that the identity crisis is purely African versus Arab is going to help that conversation move along and be any more progressive and get to where we need it to get to.
Michel Rimbaud, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I am very happy that we have entered into the heart of the matter, because of course the Sudan is a big country, but it's not isolated. It's very beautiful to talk about the conflict between the civilian leadership and the military and the coup and the coup attempt and etc., even on the electoral process that is supposed to take place next year. But the Sudan has bordered with a lot of countries in the surroundings, and it is an Arab country and an African country at the same time, even after the partition of the Sudan. And I think that we cannot talk about the future of the country and its political future, democratic or military or I don't know what, but anyway, it depends on many things, many elements that are linked to the neighboring countries and to the world environment. For example, we have not said a word about the neighboring country, about Egypt, for example, Turkey, about the African country, the corn of the African horn.
All right, but let me ask you about this.
Well, we have talked about the Troika, the Western Troika, and the United Nations. Of course, they are partners. But well, I think that in the Sudan, one of the trumps for the future is what place well the Islamism will take well in the future.
Okay, so let me, Michel Rambo, let me ask you about this because you're right. The attention has been a lot on this troika. It was what the U.S., the U.K., and Norway that have been trying to shuttle between the two sides. But we also saw, for instance, detained on Saturday the bureau chief of Qatari broadcaster Al Jazeera. And let me ask you about that, Michel Rambo. Was Musalmi El-Kabashi detained because the 24-hour news channel live streamed coverage of the protests, or was he detained because, well, his channel is from Qatar?
I don't know, but what I am sure of is that, well, we would have to talk about the Islamist parties and the Islamic regimes in the region, on the Turkish regime that is very present and that tries to impact in influence on the future of Sudan in other countries, in Egypt, of course, because Sudan remains historically and until today as a kind of a sister country to Egypt. Egypt and the Sudan. And I think that we cannot, talk about the future of the Sudan without, taking into account all the foreign interferences, not only, the Troika and the United Nations, but also some, surrounding countries, the Arab countries, Turkey, and, this conflict in the heart of the Islamist camp between the Muslim brothers and the other Islamist group. And
let me bring in on this, Kholoud Khair. Right now, today, who's got the junta's back when you look at neighboring countries, when you look at the wider region?
But, the sort of likely suspects, if you will. The easiest way to track this is to look at, international condemnation has been very swift, and obviously the wording matters. If you look at the countries that didn't, give as much or have watered down the language of other statements, they tend to be the ones that are supporting. So, for example, the Arab Axis, as the ambassador said, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi. But the US has been leaning pretty heavily on Saudi and the UAE to particularly not support monetarily. But of course, for Egypt, its proximity to Sudan means that it has other interests. And those interests do align with the military because the Sudanese military and the Egyptian military have a very long history. And there's also the question of course, the GERD Dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is one of Egypt's biggest sort of foreign policy priorities at the moment. And they're hoping that, a friendly military government in Sudan will help them achieve their goal of containing what they see as the detrimental effect of that dam. And so everyone has a different sort of priority in Sudan. With Russia, it's the naval base on the Red Sea that they're really keen to sort of see delivered after having agreed it with Bashir in 2016, 2017, I think. And so, it's going to be a tough job for either civilians or the military to meet all of these competing international interests. And so whoever takes power, whoever maintains power, is going to have a very difficult time juggling that, I think.
Jafar Mohammed Zainin, we're almost out of time. If there was one international player that you would like to appeal to, which would it be?
Well, I would like to appeal to primarily to the EU, from where I am, France, to exert more pressure and to think out of traditional box, because traditionally the West Occidental, they have used sanction leverage to pressure the ancient regime. And today the Sudanese people, they got out of the first phase of the ancient regime, and now we are falling to the second phase of the same mindset, same brotherhood, same Muslim brotherhood. Now, this brings me back to the question of Musallam al-Kabbashi. Musallam al-Kabbashi was not arrested because he is linked to Al Jazeera, who is the Qatari TV channel. No. This same regime, because this is what the people on the street, they're calling them the Inqas too, the al-Bashir too, the same Muslim brotherhood, they are coming back. They successfully manipulated these, some section of this, the stakeholders, primarily those who came through the armed struggle. They used them to divide the political incubator who was isolated from the street to pave way to the coup d'etat. So the same Muslim brotherhood. So if there is a one power, I appeal to them. European Union, primarily France, this time, right now, the elite, the EU elite, the power, should thinking of traditional box, out of traditional box, using other means to exert more pressure.
Right, not send Sudan back down the road of international isolation.
No.
Jafar Mohammed Sainin, I want to thank you. I want to thank Abdel Amin Mahmoud. I want to thank Holud Hayer for joining us from Khartoum. Michel Rimbaud from Saumur here in France. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.